While I was in France, I met up with Chris Busby, and we started the interview by talking about Libbe Halevy and Nuclear Hotseat. And of course, she just got through her 6th year of interviews and news reports about nuclear issues. So I start off the interview by asking him, would he like to wish Libbe Halevy a sort of congratulations on all her hard work. We also discussed a number of issues, including the British nuclear test veterans case, the EURATOM sort of appeal, and also Joe Mangano's and Chris Busby's new paper on child mortality caused by fracking, and more specifically possibly down to radiation from radium. So anyway, forthwith, here it is.
It for so long because I know how difficult it is to do these things, and to have been there for 5 years, is it?
6 now.
6 years, continually interviewing people and ensuring that all the connections are correct and that the internet site works and all of these things is a lot of hard work, and to have stuck it for so long is absolutely admirable, and people like Libbe are absolutely necessary to our scheme, and our scheme is to advise the public of the health effects of exposure to ionizing radiation, something which is almost entirely blanked in the main media, through producing, well, in my case, producing scientific studies and reports, which normally would only go to journals and nobody would read them. So they have to get to the public through routes like Libbe's and through the internet, essentially. The internet has opened up this whole area. It's been a massive development as far as we're concerned, and it must be a complete nightmare to those in power who are trying to sustain the control of the public and the exclusion from the public of this kind of information. So yes, jolly good, hooray for Libbe.
And of course we were discussing earlier about the journalists and their pressures they have with these slap suits, to basically stop them saying certain things about corporations and or medicines and or whatever. And we also know that Theresa May nearly lost the election completely because of social media. Even though the media was totally against Corbyn, social media was able to step in and offer truths and common sense issues and real issues as well, as opposed to the ad hominem attacks that the mainstream media were doing. Now, I'd like to sort of move on to the updates to do with the ECJ EURATOM sort of area that you're working on at the moment, and could you give us an update on the paper that you're involved with at the moment, which is to do with this, and a general update on the actual sort of specifics of who came back, who's come back to you, and how that's all working.
Well, we have to start, in case people don't know, with the background, which is that there is a law in Europe that emerged in 1996 through the EURATOM community, and the law is called the Basic Safety Standards Directive, and it controls the amount of radioactivity that people can be exposed to, essentially. And one of the clauses, because of course you never know whether your science is correct, or at least at the time the Greens in the European Parliament suggested this, that there was a clause included which said that if new and important evidence emerges about the health effects, then the whole thing has to be redone, and it's redone through what's called re-justification. Now, justification, which is defined in this law, is you say, well, we know that radiation causes a certain number of cancers, a certain number of deaths, we know that, but we're going to justify the use of radioactivity in nuclear power stations and various other schemes on the basis that we're going to allow a certain number of people to get cancer, and on the other side we balance that against the advantages to society. So that's what the law is. Okay? But the point about this law is that it has this clause which I call a suicide clause, which says that you can change the scientific basis for the amount of radioactivity that you can be exposed to if new and important evidence emerges. Well, new and important evidence has emerged after Chernobyl. Enough studies have been done after Chernobyl now to know at minimum that there have been a significant increase in congenital malformations and heritable diseases in all of the countries that have been studied. And this is a lot of different countries, and a lot of different groups have studied it, and a lot of different papers have been written, but of course none of this has been emerged in the media. So about a year ago, Professor Ingeschmitz-Feierhacker got in touch with me and said we should write a paper about this. So she sent me a lot of information, and and then she wrote a paper, and then I changed it, and it went around the place. And eventually I managed to get it published in quite a prestigious journal. So this would represent new and important evidence. Now, on the basis of that, by December of last year, we decided to ask people in the member state countries, individuals in the member state countries, to write to their EURATOM contact. The EURATOM law designates a contact in each of the countries. If a particular person, he's on a website, he's got an email, you can write to him, okay? And we asked people in the member state countries to write to their contact person and to say, you know, excuse me, but there's this new and important evidence, and it's certainly important enough to trigger this clause 6.1, and we want you to do something. So starting in December, and starting with you, in fact, writing to the Irish Radiological Protection Institute, the RPII, Radiological Protection Institute of Ireland, and I drafted the basic idea, the basic challenge, which was predicated on this paper about the congenital malformations, and said, look, you know, you've got to now discuss this and decide whether you're going to alter your dose limits. And the important thing about this is that these dose limits that derive from exposures to Chernobyl radiation, they were very low doses. They were, you know, as conventionally calculated, they were doses around the 1 millisievert, 10 millisievert level, or even less. But nevertheless, because it was internal radiation, it can't be analysed in terms of the millisievert idea, you know, as if it were external radiation, because these isotopes, these substances, a lot of them bind to DNA, of course, you know, so they accurately target the mechanism for genetic damage. So what happened was that you wrote to the RPII, I wrote to the English radiological justification people. They actually have a justification authority in England, and asked them and said, you have to do this because here's the evidence. And also I wrote to the Committee on Medical Aspects in Radiation in the Environment, or my colleague Bramhall did, and we even wrote to the ICRP as well, you know, who are the International Commission on Radiological Protection, has been the sort of gold standard for radiation protection since 1952. And we wrote, I wrote to the Swedish authorities, and my colleague Ditte Rietema wrote to the Swedish authorities. So we did Sweden, we did France. Hervé Courtois did France, and we had somebody in Denmark who wrote to the Danish authorities, and we asked various other people to write. But essentially, and I was quite astonished by this. Hardly anybody was prepared. Very, very few people were prepared to send this letter. And of course there was nothing to it. All you had to do is sign the blooming letter, you know, say I'm a citizen of the country, do something, see. There was somebody in Germany who said he'd done it, but I haven't heard back from him. But I have heard back from and then somebody in Italy I sent, Austria I sent, but I haven't heard back from any of those people. And these are all big deal anti-nuclear activists, you know. I mean, we're not talking about just some guy, Mrs. Smith at the corner shop. We're talking about some, you know, people who would consider themselves to be the head of anti-nuclear activity in the particular country, you know. Global 2000. Guy was the head of Global 2000 in Austria, and Austria is like a big anti-nuclear nation. Nothing, okay. I even met the guy I went to North Wales to a conference there. I asked a lot of those North Wales people who were all like, you know, opposed to this nuclear power station, opposed to that nuclear power. Nobody did anything. Nobody.
I noticed the same thing with the contacts that I had. I was contacted them. I said, look, all you've got to do is sign it, send it off, keep the pressure on, let them know that we're interested in this. And many people, but I was thinking maybe that it had something to do with this this dumbing down of information and the threat of legal action. And
I think it has to do with fear, Sean. I mean, I had talked to a lot of people about this, and it's something that's emerged in the last 5 years. Is there's a kind of fear of a bad response from the authorities, or somebody like getting at you and so on. It's always been the case that there are an awful lot of people who will talk to each other and have conferences about these things, and so they all go to a conference and they go blah blah blah, and the audience all clap and people get up and say, oh, isn't it the case that, oh yes, that's right, isn't it awful, and so forth. But if it comes to actual activity, there are very, very few people who, dare I say it, are brave enough to do these things. I mean, for example, Libbe Halevy, she's brave enough to do this. She must know that somebody could rub her out, because this is America. Yes, people have been rubbed out in America for this kind of stuff, you know. Sure. So when you start this, and when I started this, you have to consider that they might kill you. That's the worst that can happen. But there's a whole list of things that can happen before that. You know, they can get onto your income tax people, or they can get onto your. And in one case, this guy in Japan that I know, they actually tried to murder his kid, you know. So, like, these things happen. I have to say not much has happened to me yet, anyway, touch wood.
Apart from your emails being disappearing.
Well, look at that sort of thing, you know. They get into your computer and take evidence away and do that stuff, you know, that's true. But nobody's actually tried to kill me. Sure. I made it quite clear that if anyone does and they don't quite make it, then they're going to be in deep trouble. You know? Because I'm not a sort of chicken, you know. I'm not a little sort of cuddly bunny, you know.
But you're so very high profile. It would be. It seems that they tend to work in the way the Stasi work.
Anyway, the way they go for me is they go for me by credibility. So they write reams of nonsense in Wikipedia. Wikipedia turned me recently from a scientist into an activist. Yeah. You know, and so I got somebody to turn it back very recently. But if you read my Wikipedia entry, it's just like ridiculous. So they do that kind of thing. Sure. They do that kind of thing. You know. Anyway, to get back to the EURATOM thing, we did actually. It does work. So this is the first thing you have to know: is it does work. They scared to death. They're terrified of all of this, and they take a long time. They took 2 months to reply to me, and then there was a really considered response. You know, and mostly all of the responses we've had have essentially said, except for the Irish one,
exactly,
have essentially, and the ICRP one, they actually sort of dealt with what we were saying. Because what we're saying is this: look, the small amounts of radiation exposure that occurred after Chernobyl caused like a doubling of congenital malformations. Okay, and that's what we're saying. So therefore, anyone living near a nuclear power station or anyone exposed to these things in another situation will also have a doubling of congenital malformation. And of course this is true, and then a lot of those children die. So as I did recently, my recent study about fracking, which I did with Joe Mangano,
we're going to come on to that,
we'll talk about later, but children die, you see. Now the point is that you cannot justify an operation in which children die. And I'm not talking about a small amount of children, I'm talking about a significant number of dead children. And if you take it over the whole period of time, there's an awful lot of them, millions. Or if you go back over the fallout and all the rest of it. But the point is, we now have the evidence from Chernobyl that this is the case. Chernobyl was a ghastly experiment. It wasn't intended as an experiment, but given that it happened, it was an experiment. Another one is Fukushima, you see, and what they try to do is they put the lid on all of this and say, oh, nothing happened, it's perfectly all right, and they bring in a load of bogus scientists to say, oh, well, we've done this study and that study, and nothing happens, and so on. But enough scientists in countries who are kind of, if you like, non-aligned, so Turkey, Croatia, Egypt, Italy, quite a few countries where they studied the effects of Chernobyl, and we're talking about somewhere a long way away from Chernobyl, Greece, for example, okay? So you got a big increase in infant leukemia in Greece, long way away from Chernobyl. The doses were like less than a millisievert, okay? Significant excess of infant leukemia, which is a congenital malformation, basically. It's a heritable thing that occurs in the germ cell or in the developing fetus. Sure. So anyway, mostly what they did was they wrote back, and in some cases they just refused to write back. So in the case of Sweden, we actually had to go to the Swedish authority.
The video of you doorstepping
and
them,
bang on the blooming door and say, "Oi, you know, this is the law." And then we wrote, and so then following from that, so then he wrote back and he said, "Oh, we trust the International Commission on Radiological Protection." They didn't say anything about our evidence. They just said, "We leave it to the ICRP." But the law is nothing to do with the ICRP. The law is that that person and his organisation are the competent authority in the national member state, and they have to decide on the basis of all of the evidence what the situation is. I mean, they can certainly consider what the ICRP says, but the ICRP is not a legal body. It's just it's an independent organisation.
Charity, is it?
It's a charity. It gets funding by the nuclear industry and all sorts of people. They don't tell you who funds it, but anyway, the point is there it is. And I have to say that the calibre of the people in the ICRP is not high, to put it mildly. And basically there are a lot of radiologists and nuclear physicists and all these people. Okay, so back to Sweden. So we doorstepped the guy, and eventually he was forced to write to us, and he said, well, we're not going to do anything, we rely on the ICRP. So I took that letter, and I sent it, together with a covering letter, to the Swedish, what's it called, the Justice Chancellor. Now, Sweden is interesting. In Denmark, long ago, the King of Denmark decided he didn't trust his various ministries, so he set up an independent ministry called the Chancellor, the Justice Chancellor, the Justitiekansliet, and this outfit are supposed to, this is their job, is supposed to look over the legal situation with all the other ministries, and if there's something dodgy going on, they've got to do something about it. So anyway, we wrote to them, and we also wrote to the Environment Ministry, because the Environment Ministry are supposed to be the people who are administering this EURATOM thing. So they're the administrators. They take advice from SSM. This is the guy, the EURATOM guy. So he gives the advice. His advice is, oh, it's no problem, the ICRP is great. So I write to the Environment Ministry, because they're the people who actually administer the law, like the Environment Agency in Ireland. And so that they wrote back and said, oh, we trust the SSM, you know. So that's my letter got back, we trust the SSM. So that's the situation in Sweden, and we're still waiting to hear back from the Justitiekansliet. But if we don't hear from them, or even if we do hear from them, but it's a bit later, we're going to take the whole lot of this back to Europe now. So then we go to the European Commission, and we say we want this now to go to the European Court of Justice, because they have not administered the law. The law says these people must do that, and they haven't done it. Okay,
they're just quoting the ICRP.
They're just saying, oh no, we're not going to do it because the ICRP hasn't said anything about it.
Interestingly, the Irish EPA, they stepped in, and they said that there did seem to be some problems with what the ICRP are saying is the safe doses of radiation.
Internal.
Now they also said, you know, that they kind of are going with it, but they are aware that there is an argument to be had about the levels and the damage they cause.
Well, the Irish people particularly referred to Kerry. So, I mean, without going into great depth, I managed to persuade the minister, Michael Meacher, in 2000, to set up the committee examining radiation risks from internal emitters. And so this whole area has been fought over already, okay, long ago. And it didn't really, nothing much came out of it, except the final report did say that there were questions about using using the concept of absorbed dose, millisieverts, to define what happens with internal radiation. So there's a whole history of this. But it was quite clear that the woman who wrote back to you from the RPII was aware of this. That she was aware, well, I mean, they're all aware of it, but she was prepared to concede that she was aware of it, and that it was a debate, but that she said, I think she said something like, well, you know, we're still waiting to see if there's any more information, or something like that. So it wasn't really, it actually wasn't a proper response, because she didn't deal with the Schmitz-Foyle paper.
But she obviously did say that she was putting that to someone else.
Yeah, she did.
And they're doing that at the moment.
She said they were still kind of like discussing something like that. And of course, you know, Ireland is ideal for this, because Ireland has nothing to gain from this particular thing. Of course, you know, there might be behind the scenes pressure and so forth, but there are no nuclear power stations in Ireland. That's the point.
And in fact, in the constitution, nuclear power and nuclear weapons are against.
Well, right. So Ireland, as a member state country, could do it, and also Austria could. But Austria, they haven't even sent it to the Austrian guy, you know. So goodness knows what's going on there. In France. Well, just
sorry,
quickly finish this. So we've done Sweden, we've done Ireland. England, they got back and said they weren't doing anything, so we're going to send them straight to... And Kamari got back and they wrote some complete nonsense, which sort of dealt with it in a kind of way, but looked at evidence that was too old.
in the UK,
Kamari is the UK, is the Committee Examining Radiation Risk from Internal Emitters. They were set up after the Sellafield child leukemia inquiry in 1993, and I mean, I have to say they're a bunch of dodgy characters and always have been. But at the moment they're not only a bunch of dodgy characters, but they're also a bunch of stupid dodgy characters, you know. So their response was pathetic, and they just referred to evidence that was a long time ago, 2002 and so on. And since this is new and important evidence, something that happened in 2002 is irrelevant. Yeah.
Okay, so that's two slaps.
So that's those two. So then the French wrote back and said, you know, basically we're not going to do anything. We rely on the ICRP.
Sure.
And so did the Danes. The Danes
right.
were, but there was a lot of toing and froing with the Danes, because they wrote back and they said we're not going to deal with it. And then so my Danish guy asked me, and he wrote back and said, well, blah blah, and they wrote back and said blah. So there was a bit of toing and froing, but ultimately they said we rely on the ICRP. We're not going to do anything now. So that what they all have in common, these people, is they have all referred it back to they've all said to us that they are referring it, that it's an ICRP matter, nothing to do with them, which is not the law. That's the point. The law is it's nothing to do with the ICRP.
That's right.
The law is that the ball is in their court. They have to deal with it. They have to deal with the evidence, the new and important evidence. They can't just say, they can't just not mention the evidence. Sure. I mean, what they could have said, none of them did, that you made all this up.
Okay.
They could have said all of these different studies in the different countries were made up by anti-nuclear activists and we don't trust any of them. They could have said the populations were not properly defined, the epidemiology was no good, you know, like the people who did it weren't proper epidemiologists.
There was no challenge to the
there was none. There was no challenge to and there hasn't ever been, there hasn't been any. So nobody's written a paper saying that there were these problems with this paper.
The paper's out there, it's not being contested.
No, and it's been there for a year. And not only that, and we did reply, we sent this as well, my colleague Alexandra Fuchik, who I was with on the child health study, we had a big organisation called the Policy Information Network on Child Health and Environment around about 2004. It lasted for 3 years, and we produced a report. And she and I were the co-rapporteurs on radiation. And she's a good guy, she's a scientist. She was an advisor to the WHO for a while, maybe still is, in Croatia. And she wrote a paper after the Schmutzfeuer paper, like in about, I think, July 2016, in which she looked at genomic damage in populations exposed to Chernobyl. And so this was a big review paper in a posh journal. So this is another paper that shows that these small amounts of internal radiation are causing, you know, big changes in genetic damage, big increases in genetic damage. So there's lots of evidence out there now which shows that the Basic Safety Standards Directive has to be redone. And so that's the battleground. Okay,
so just to finish off this EURATOM section, and I wanted to bring up yet another paper that you're involved with that seems to hint at radiological damage in Pennsylvania. But just to finish off for our UK viewers, the Brexit situation. Now, when we're talking about EURATOM, when we were looking at it, it seemed that the UK had its own independent EURATOM format for dealing with these issues, if I'm right. And so do you think that the Brexit will affect the UK petition, or as we're having to deal with a separate UK sort of section of this EURATOM law, will there be no effect? What would you
I think that the transposition of the BSS into English law, in fact there's been an update of that which is coming into force in 2018, but the update is not sufficiently different from the original one to make any difference as far as this re-justification is concerned.
Brexit or no Brexit, the petition still goes ahead because you're doing it specific
it's
to
all
the UK
same.
law.
The only thing that we can't do now is that if they say, well, we're not going to do anything, we can't chop them up to the European commission because it's nothing to do with that.
But the UK High Courts.
But of course, we could do that. We could do that, but that takes money. I mean, I'd like to do that actually. I'd like to do a judicial review as well. But the last time I tried a judicial review, the table judge, that's the guy who says we're going to allow this or we're not going to allow this, he threw it out for no good reason at all. But because the law is bought and sold, as we know from the Tesfair's case. You can get dodgy judges.
Yeah.
And so he threw it out. Not only that, then they fined us £2,750. I had to give them £2,750 for having had the temerity to suggest that they might be wrong in the interpretation of the law. Okay,
Yeah.
Boof.
Yeah, no, it's certainly there's been a lot of issues with the UK judicial system, and what sort of biases have been brought into various court cases, not just to do with nuclear. But right, okay, well let's move on now, because within the EURATOM we're saying petition, we're saying look, here is the evidence. The amount of dose that's been worked out has been worked out over 75 years and not a shorter time frame where the damage is happening. That seems to be sort of the basis of some of the petition that we're doing. So when we're looking at the fracking and uranium paper that yourself and Joe Mangano have done, then what sort of it's had about 3,300 odd downloads in the last month.
It's going well. Well, that hasn't been covered in any newspaper.
Any newspaper has not covered it. It's not been challenged.
No.
Okay, and so we have these 2 points, and but what I wanted to do is zero in, because this can be found online, and we'll link to it. But the issue about the isotopes causing damage from the fracking. Where are these isotopes coming from? Are they coming from the rocks that are being fractured? Are they coming from, because there's obviously people saying that they're in the fluids that are causing the fracking. What's your anticipation on where these... It's radium, is it?
Yeah, well, underground there's a lot of natural background radiation, and this is mainly in uranium-238. Now, uranium-238 is ubiquitous, and when it decays through uranium-234 to radium-226. So anywhere where you're going to find uranium, you're going to find radium as well, and it's in all of the rocks underground. So if they go down and they smash the rocks into little pieces, the surface area of the rock becomes much greater, of course, and so the water that's down there, and also including the water they pump down, which is a lot of water that they pump down with various chemicals to free up the spaces and so forth, sand mainly to sort of, as what they call proppant. So then the newly formed surfaces with all its radium and uranium and all that dissolve in the water, mainly radium, because radium is more soluble than uranium. Uranium is quite insoluble. But so when they pump this stuff down, then it fills up with radium, and when it comes to the surface it has lots of radium. This has been known since the 80s, and in connection with oil exploration, not fracking, but just standard oil drilling in Louisiana and Texas and so on. The produced water that comes up, that pushes the oil up, that's very radioactive. It's huge amounts of radium in it, and then they leave all this the water to evaporate in the sun, and then radium just is everywhere. And I've done a lot of court cases in Louisiana and in Texas and down south where they do all this on this issue. So there's no question about it going.
In the respect that the actual radium and the liquid that it's in basically is leaching into aquifers and into the wells.
My own feeling is that. And this is speculation, but certainly it comes up with the water, and then that water is supposed to be treated. It's supposed to be taken away because they know it's radioactive. But there are a number of times where they just don't bother. They just tip it, because it's cheaper for them, and then it gets into the groundwater. But also it gets into the groundwater directly because the groundwater is in the ground. So if you drill a well anywhere, you'll get water out. That's well known.
So there's two pathways, basically.
So the people who have private water wells, their wells will be contaminated with radium because of this, through this effect. You see,
either of the two pathways.
Yes.
Basically.
Well, that's what I followed up in the paper. I looked at the density of private water wells in the counties of Pennsylvania. And what we found was a clear correlation between the increase in infant mortality from congenital, early infant mortality, 0 to 28 days. We saw a clear increase in that, directly proportional to the density of private water wells in the counties. So that's what made me feel that was the effect. Of course, we can't rule out that it was an effect due to some chemical that they produced, you know, that went into the groundwater. But it's not it's not actually a vapor chemical, because then it wouldn't have been related to the density of water wells. It would have been just people would have inhaled it and so on. So we would have had an effect that wasn't related to the density.
It would have been larger afield than the water
well,
wells.
It would have just we had 20 counties, and so you could list those counties on a graph according to the number, the water well density. And, you know, the bigger the water well density, the more dead babies, basically.
Right, so what I'd like to do now, because we're trying get to the end, but we talked a bit about the BNTV case.
Yeah, you want to know where that went to?
British nuclear test veterans.
Okay, well, we lost the case in December. The judge threw out our experts and said they were all activists. And basically the judge didn't respond to the evidence. So there was a lot of evidence brought in by the eminent experts that I called. Of course, I could no longer act as an expert because he ruled me out as an activist. So then I brought in 4 other professors, one from Japan, one from Germany, and one from England, one from Ireland. These eminent people with like hundreds of papers to their name, scientific papers. And they were magnificent. They were absolutely magnificent. They were attacked to death by the Ministry of Defence lawyer, Adam Heppenstall, but they just stood their ground, and I brought tears to my eyes watching this old lady, Inga Schmitz-Feuerhaker, you know, taking on this lawyer who was really quite rude, you know, and offhand and cruel. Anyway, she dealt with him, and in fact they all did. But the judge then said, oh, well, they're activists, and, you know, I'm not going to listen to anything that they say, so he didn't address it. But the interesting thing that happened was that the lawyer Heppenstall, that the Ministry of Defence mainly consisted of trying to exclude all our evidence. So so he wrote a report about halfway through towards the end of the trial, in which he said that he didn't need to deal with, because we'd said, look, he hasn't dealt with any of our evidence. The High Court judge before had said that the way this case had to go was that we provide our evidence, they deal with the evidence, we respond to their evidence, then we go into trial, you see. But none of this happened, because we provided our evidence and they didn't respond to our evidence. They just said a whole lot. They just came in with a complete different set of their own ideas using standard ICRP methodology. This was the dose, too low to cause the cancers, couldn't have caused the congenital malformation in the children. So that's what they said.
I read the documents, and Geraldine Thomas at one point actually said, even though she'd been slated by other scientists and they had to pull the BBC documentary, but where she was saying that 100 millisieverts per year is or under, it would cause no health effects whatsoever, ignoring all the linear models.
Their position that they presented was the standard ICRP position. But here's the point. The point is that Heppenstall and the Treasury solicitor stated quite clearly that they didn't have to respond in writing to what it was our experts were saying, because their experts had been given this information and they would respond in the witness box. Okay, that's written down, black and white.
Yes.
But when it came to the cross-examination, which I did, they said, and I asked them specifically, they said they hadn't been asked to deal with this evidence, and that Heppenstall had not provided them with this with a remit to respond to the evidence. Now the point is that the High Court had said that this is how the case should be done, but it wasn't done like that. It was fitted up. So it was fitted up in such a way, and we don't know to the extent to which the judge was colluding with this, and I haven't said that he was, but he might have been. But certainly the strategy of the MOD solicitor was to exclude all of this evidence, but he mucked up, because he said that he had told his experts to deal with it, and in fact they said he hadn't.
Did you actually say that the experts were given guidelines and what they could talk about and what they couldn't?
Well, no, it wasn't that. They were told. They said that they were not told. They were not asked to deal with any of the evidence that we put in.
Yeah,
that's what they
by
said.
Someone.
Well, yeah, no, by the Treasury Solicitor. He's the one who commissions them.
Okay.
You know, he gets
and
them
that
along.
goes against the recommendations of the judge.
That goes against the recommendations of the judge that set up this, because, you know, this came from an appeal. So the original judge, then there was an appeal, now there's a new trial. This is the new trial, okay? Well, the appeal judge said that Sir William Charles, he said this is how it's got to be done, but it wasn't done like that, you see. It wasn't done like that. And not only was it not done like that, but it was not done like that in a sort of sneaky way, yes?
Okay.
So the point is that what I did was I shopped up Heppenstall to the Bar Standards Council.
Okay. I think we're on slap suit number 3 at the moment, Chris, so
no,
anyway, do carry on.
I mean, they can slap at me as much as they like, you know.
Well, it's usually the journalists that get hit, but we're bloggers and we don't really care. So
I don't care, no. I mean, this is the truth. So we've sent Heppenstall off to the Bar Standards Board, and they're taking it up too. So they wrote back and said, oh yes, this is very serious accusation, blah, 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 blah. But they said, we're going to wait now, in the letter I got, or the phone call I got from this woman from the Bar Standards Board, she said, we're going to wait now until we see what the judge says in the appeal, because we've appealed on the basis of this, you see.
Okay, so we've knocked it down the road.
We've sent it back to the appeal court, you see. So the guy, so there's the appeal court guy, he says, this is how it should be done. So I've then said, appeal, appeal, appeal. They didn't do it like this. It's gone back to him, you see. All right, now, so he's in a difficult place, you know, because he's got to now decide whether it was done properly or not. And it quite obviously wasn't done properly, okay? So, but I tell you what, if he decides that he's going to throw it out, then he's going to go to the Bar Standards Council, all right? Because he will have made a statement, this is how it should be done. It wasn't done like that, and he hasn't done anything about it.
Okay, right. So you've pinned him down there.
So that's the position there.
Now, I'd just like to go back to the point where they said they are activists, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Now, according to this judge, it would appear that if you're a black person, if you're a person of colour, that you wouldn't be able to talk on matters of discrimination. Would that be a natural progression of this new judicial thing, where that if you're an activist, you can't talk about an ecological activist, you can't talk about ecology, and if you're a black person, you wouldn't be able to talk about discrimination.
I think it's but actually it's not the judge. It's a particularly monstrous interpretation of precedent. There is law about this. There are various cases, and the main one it's based on is a case called the Icarian Reefer.
Sure.
Where some ship had some disaster, and they brought in an expert witness who then turned out to then have a position because he was connected in some way to the company who, and this is fair enough really, so he was connected to the company who had who the outcome of the trial, which would have affected. So if he was biased, all right, effectively that was it.
Sure.
So the Sir William Charles judge, the appeal court judge, he was asked to rule on this point of the Icarian Reefer about whether I had a position, whether I had a kind of pre-existing position, and I was not basically an independent, neutral expert. Okay, but of course all scientists have a position. You know, their position is developed as a result of the research that they've done, and you know the way in which they've approached it.
Told to say,
mainly, it's about interpretation. It's about interpretation. Yeah. But in the case of the nuclear industry expert witnesses, well, no, what shall I call them? The MOD expert witnesses. I mean, certainly one of them, that appalling Thomas woman, she was just quite clearly biased. I mean, you know, it was just absurdly biased. I mean, nothing like the sort of thing I am. You know, she was just talking nonsense. She was like talking stuff just in order to prove her position.
Do you think she was better paid than you, though, as well?
Well, I wasn't paid at all.
All right, so she was better paid.
She can't have been paid. She can't have been paid less than I was paid.
Okay. So, all right. So the bottom line is with that is that this issue about, you know,
and my experts, incidentally, talking about paid, they weren't paid either. I gave them 200 quid because because basically that's like the extra expenses that you get.
Do you have any figures on how much the MOD costs are?
I think that Di Williams said it was over 2 million.
2 million for that, just that portion of the court case.
Oh no, well no, it must be. I mean, those people like Heppenstall, they go out for like £2,000 a day, and this is like 3 weeks.
Okay, all right. So it's very lucrative for the.
Oh, God's teeth, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
You know?
You ever thought about swapping sides and you know, you could buy Moët and.
Listen, you've got to live with yourself. You know, you're on this planet for a certain length of time, and how these people can live with themselves is entirely beyond me.
Sure.
How that woman, maybe she's just stupid and she believes that stuff, but anyway.
Well, I was doing some communication with her in the early days of Fukushima, and she was getting all her information, anything to do with dose, anything complicated. And we were talking about cesium and its effects in Chernobyl, and she was saying there was no effect. And in fact, she was giving me a lot of paperwork that was coming direct from a guy called Richard Wakeford, who obviously you know. So I've seen nothing to say that she's developed this knowledge herself. I think she's getting it from a third party.
Well, it's certainly not her area. I mean, her area, she's a biochemist. I mean, although you would think you wouldn't understand that by listening to what she says about chemistry, but that's her particular area, biochemistry.
Right. Okay. Anyway, let's try and avoid slap suit number 5. So we'll. I think we could probably just try and finish up here now. I know that you can't talk about the USS Ronald Reagan particularly.
Well, except to say that the case is going forward, and it's with this is the case where the people who went to help the population of Fukushima in U.S. Navy fleet, headed up by the USS Ronald Reagan, and then they copped quite a lot of radioactivity from which we blew out to sea and blew over there. Sure. And so there was a lot of those people are sick with cancer and various other illnesses, and so they brought a case against TEPCO and General Electric, well, TEPCO mainly, and the TEPCO lawyers argued that it should be heard in Japan, and of course the lawyers in California, my lawyers, because I'm on that case, they said it should be heard in California because it was like an American ship. And then so this went up to the Ninth Circuit, to the appeal court, to decide whether it should be heard in one place or another. Sure. And the U.S. State Department has said that they don't have anything to say about it. They're not going to argue that it should be heard in Japan. And in fact, they sort of came out in favour of it being heard in America. That was the last. So, but that's still at the appeal court, and so that's not going to go ahead until the appeal court makes a decision following their amicus brief. It's an amicus curiae, this is like a friend of the court brief from the US State Department.
I realise you can't talk about processes while the case is ongoing, so...
Well, I can't talk about what we're going to say.
What you're going to say. So, is there anybody else involved with that in terms of experts?
As far as I know, Helen Caldecott has been asked to be involved as an expert. I'm doing a case with her at the moment on... with the same law firm in Illinois, which is sort of going ahead. But I've got to go there next week.
Mm-hmm. And what's that concerning?
Oh, that's a straightforward case. There's some guys well, I better not say anything about it.
Okay, right. No, that's fine. Yeah. That's fine. Well, look, Chris. I think we can round off here. I think we're going to have a little part 2. There's just a couple of little questions I wanted to ask about you personally, your history, and things like this. But thank you very much for all the information that you've given us. Thanks for all your work in terms of all the court cases that you're involved with and that you're trying to be involved with in the future. I just hope that you're going to get more support from the community at large. I realise they have their pressures. We talked about slap suits with journalists. We talked about, we talked a little bit about the surveillance, especially in the UK, which is, Edward Snowden has said it's the worst in the world. And I'm obviously a victim of some of that stuff myself.
Well, I'm kind of on my own, you know. I mean, I have been sort of, in some strange way, excluded from the mainstream anti-nuclear movement and the mainstream green movement. I mean, probably following Monbiot, but we're going to win this, and the way that we're going to win this is through science. We're going to do it through scientific journals, publishing stuff like this this Mangano paper about fracking, that's going to go into the peer review literature. Increasingly I'm being approached by journals to write papers for them. You know, I mean, they write to me all the time.
Sure.
And also they write to me to be a reviewer. So I'm like the big deal scientist in this area, but interestingly I'm totally excluded from the normal discourse amongst...
It is very bizarre, because you are connected with quite a few journals now.
Yes,
you have papers that are constantly
it's
coming out.
extraordinary. So for instance,
And
you know, they have a meeting in London recently, we were talking about that, or I was talking about that, where there are all these people talking about nuclear, and not a single person is talking about the health effects, and not a single, well, maybe one person is, fairly, but all of the papers, like 30 papers that I've got in the peer review literature showing that there are such health effects. Hinkley Point, Bradwell, Charles Phillips, nuclear power stations, that one in America, Diablo Canyon, is it, that one? I've studied loads and loads of these sites and done standard epidemiological studies that show that there's an effect, yet nobody uses them. Nobody uses them. I mean, well, and this is the anti-nuclear people, they don't use them. They even get into the Daily Mail and they get into newspapers. But the anti-nuclear groups and the green groups and all that just refuse to deal with them at all. They don't use them.
Well, I think we were talking about the fact that if they were to, and it's certainly you've been seeing what's been happening with me on my Facebook over the last week, where I get, as soon as I talk about some sort of health effect of an isotope, in this case plutonium, that I have somebody from Australia, somebody from America, somebody from the UK, all connected to the nuclear industry, and one of them connected to Wade Allison, the very big pro-nuke guy, trying to actually pull apart my argument that there's a problem with this plutonium. Now, they lost that argument on the Facebook. You know, they did their basic science was wrong. They didn't want to discuss the basic science. They just wanted to sort of beat around the bush and try and say that the article itself was bad. It's another ad hominem attack on the journalist, basically.
I can't understand it. I mean, I really can't understand it.
But I think a lot of the activists, a lot of the people at the top of the Green Party, they'll get the Roger Helbigs, all these different people that will contact them and put huge pressure on them. You know, and we're not talking about just one person. I think we're talking about multiple people sending emails, letters, and whatnot.
I don't know. It's
a great pressure on them.
I think I've been categorised as some kind of monster. I think that's what it is. You know, some frightening person. I think somebody did say that to me. You know, said that they're just frightened of you being there. They're frightened that you'll do something.
Well, maybe it's the beret, Chris.
Well, it's got to be more than that. I mean, Linus Pauling wore a beret. Yeah. Lots of people, and Messiaen, you know, there are lots of people who wear berets.
No, this is true. This is true. Well, look, Chris, thanks a lot for the interview. We're going to pass this on to Libbe Halevy. She's probably going to cut and edit and mess around with it and squeeze it into her show.
Okay.
And yeah, any final word for Libbe? You know, great 6 years of constant high pressure activism.
Well, I'll give her a big hug and a kiss. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. There we go, 47 minutes.
Well, that's